Welcome to the second class and study of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 in the textbooks. That's what you should be thinking about reading, having it open next to you while you listen to the lecture and watch the video and pay attention to the PowerPoints. Enjoy! The key terms in tonight's class are interaction, adaptation, and a concept, the evolutionary perspective on our development versus the lifespan development. So think for a minute about the term interaction. Take a minute and write down a definition of it. The other important term is adaptation. Adapting to something, getting used to it, being successful in it. And lastly, this concept of this versa here, evolutionary perspective versus the... So, I'm going to be thinking about 4 questions that I'd like you to know the answers to and make some notes as we're going along and refer to your textbook to answer these questions. What is the evolutionary perspective? Do you know the word evolution? What does that mean to you? What picture does it bring to your mind? Second point, what are the genetic foundations of development? Genetic comes from the word genes. So we'll be talking about those a lot in this class. What are some reproductive challenges and choices for humans? What challenges do we face as humans in reproducing the species? What choices do we have? And lastly, how do heredity, what we get from our parents, from our relatives, and environment, where we grow up and how we grow up, how do they interact? The evolutionary perspective, an important concept and an important topic for tonight. Our bodies have evolved over millions of years, slowly getting used to the African savanna, the African plains, on which 98% of our ancestors lived and died. So too did our brains develop over all of that time. Evolutionary psychology, the evolutionary perspective on human development, argues that the mind is shaped by the pressure to survive and reproduce. Think about that. The mind is shaped by the pressure of the species to survive and reproduce. They argue that that explains all of our development. What do you think? So the example they give to that is that the fact that children, human children, have the longest period of childhood of any other species. This is to allow the species the time to develop the large brain that it needs to learn the complexity, to learn how to live in our very complicated and challenging human society. A horse is born, it stands up and runs. And even a baby elephant is born, it's able to stand up and feed itself. What can humans do when they're born? Not much. Another aspect, another theme of this evolutionary perspective that we evolved, humans evolve to survive in our complicated society, is this 2 ideas: natural selection, nature selecting the strongest specimens, the strongest humans to survive, and those humans are strong because they can adapt to their environment. The natural selection is an evolutionary process. By which those individuals of a species that are best adapted to the environment are the ones that survive and reproduce. Adaptive behavior is that behavior that promotes the organism's survival. It gets used to it. The species that don't get used to it, don't adapt, don't survive. You think of any examples of that. Right now, stop listening and write down in your notebook an example of a species, you'll have to Google it, that didn't survive or that is disappearing because it's not adapting well. So, to review, in the process of natural selections, it happens in nature. Individuals who are well adapted to a special set of conditions have an advantage. They're going to do better because they adapt better over those who are not well adapted. This advantage means that they survive and they are able to go on and reproduce. The second part of this is that traits that we inherit, that humans inherit from their parents, from their ancestors, that make them more likely to adapt, that make them fitter, are then passed on to their offspring, thus giving the offspring the same advantages. Let's look at an example of this natural selection. Here's a family of bugs. Some of the bugs are green, some of the bugs are beige. The bird, one of their natural enemies, prefers the green bugs. So the green bugs, and eats the green bugs. The beige bugs are adapted to their environment. They're safe. So eventually, the beige bugs, who are safe in the environment and will survive and preserve that species, will reproduce themselves. The green bugs aren't able to, and over time, the green bugs disappear. And in this example, natural selection has occurred. Let's look at now, another very, very important point is adaptive behavior. This is so important. Adapt. If you came from another country, do you remember getting used to living here? I lived in Hong Kong and Germany and London, England, and even Texas. I had to adapt to those places. I had to evolve. I had to change some behaviors, some cultural behaviors, to learn some other languages to survive. And this kind of behavior that those of you who have lived outside your own natural environment, this behavior is called adaptive behavior. So the definition is a type of behavior that is used to adjust, adapt to another type of behavior or situation. I'd like you here to at this point in your notebook, to list some adaptive behavior that you have had to develop. See, we're coming back to that word, development. Adaptation, adapting, adjusting is part of our development. So list those and bring them to class next time for us to talk about those examples. What does it take to adapt successfully? Psychologists say that there are 4 parts to that. The first part is really figuring out what behavior is necessary to achieve my goal. So when I went to Hong Kong, I had to think about how to adjust to living there. 99% of the other people in Hong Kong, 99% are Chinese. My goal was to fit in, to make friends, to teach, to have a good life there, a productive life, and to make that possible for my family. So I had to think about what behaviors were going to help me achieve that goal. Then I had to think, so this one is behavior. I had to think about what's needed. What do I have to acquire to do that goal? Then I have to decide and recognize, when do I stop the activity, these behaviors? When am I adjusted? When does my development can stop? And then lastly, what should I do next after I've achieved that goal, after I've adapted? So we have to first recognize what's the problem. Secondly, what tools do I need? What's the best tool I need to achieve the goal? How long should I work at it? How hard should I work at achieving that goal? Is there a point where I'd be putting too much energy into that goal and ignoring the other important ones? For example, in my example, adjusting to Hong Kong, did I risk putting too much emphasis on adjusting to Hong Kong and then ignore my family and my children? Okay, so that's the idea. When do I stop the activity? And then lastly, the decision, what do I do next? This is a photo that you might recognize of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. People had to adapt or lose their homes, move away, or develop severe psychological problems or severe physical problems. Here are some people who are already adapting. Make some notes. What behavior are they doing to achieve the goal of adapting? What tools have they decided they need to achieve the goal? Now, I don't want you to say, well, they need a hammer and they need a wrench. I want you to think deeper. Are there any psychological tools, any physical tools that are helping them achieve that goal? When should they stop working on adapting to Katrina? And then what would they do next? Again, make some notes on that. We're going to talk about adaptation from your notes. So, summing up the evolutionary perspective on development, on behavior developing, the importance of adaptation to the environment, the importance of behaviors that preserve the species. The species, like the green bugs, won't die out because of this behavior, and the fact that the fittest, the ones who adapt the best, survive. And fit, in this perspective, is defined as the ability to bear offspring, more generations. And the evolutionary perspective argues that that's our prime goal. Now, for the next part, and kind of linking the evolutionary perspective and the lifespan development perspective, think about two questions the lifespan psychologists have asked themselves. If the point of our development is to reproduce, why do we live so long after we reproduce? And their answer is, look at human beings and ask the question. Perhaps older people are still about evolution and preservation of the species because they're improving the survival rates of babies. Think about that. Do you have an example? Does that make sense? Think about that. Make a note around slide. Welcome again. Before we start this section of the course, I'd like you to watch video 2. You have a list of videos that I've provided to you, and the video that will help you understand this section on genetics is video number 2. We're not a biology course, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about the makeup of genes. Just enough for you to know that all human life begins as a single cell. That's amazing right now to think about. In each cell, the nucleus, or the center, contains what are called chromosomes. These chromosomes are made up of DNA. DNA looks like threads. I have a photo on the next slide. We've all heard of DNA. It's in the news a lot now. What uses does DNA have in courts and in fighting crime? Think of that. You know what DNA is. Biologically, DNA is complex. It has many parts. It's a molecule. A molecule is made up of many cells. That's all that a molecule is. It's a lot of cells bounded together. And this DNA, the most important thing about it is that it has our genetic information. What color hair we have, how tall we'll be, facial structure, everything about us that's determined by genes. A gene is a short part of DNA, and each of us has over 20,000 genes. Now, you don't have to remember this for the quiz. You won't be tested on it. It's just a basic introduction to what a gene is, because we'll be talking about genes when we talk about heredity. We get our genes from our parents. The traditional debates, long-term debates, have been about whether genes influence our behavior. They certainly influence our appearance, but do they influence our behavior? That is the big debate in science. So again, take time now to stop and watch video 2. This information is just a review of what I talked you through on the previous slide. The basic building structure for humans is the cell. At the center of the cell is this little tiny nucleus. The rest of the material of the cell protects the nucleus. In the nucleus are chromosomes, and chromosomes unwind to form many, many DNAs. And the DNA has the codes that determine who we are. The debate is, does this DNA determine our behavior or just our biology, what we look like? That's the debate. I'm sure you've watched the video now and got a better idea of what I was talking about in the last 2 or 3 slides. I'm going to talk for a minute about the laws of genetics. Now remember, talked about genetics. You know that genetics is the study of genes, and you know that genes contain the codes to determine our appearance. And there are many, many scientists that argue that our genes also determines our behavior, that we inherit the way we behave. Do you agree with that? Write a paragraph now, please, saying that you agree and why. I agree that my behavior has been inherited because, or I believe that my behavior has not been inherited because. I want to hear these in class. Turkheim, a famous scientist of genetics, put out 3 laws around behavior genetics. First, he argued that all behavior can be inherited. Wow, what a big sentence. What a big thought. What's he saying there? Secondly, that, now listen carefully, the effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. In other words, what? In other words, we have inherited genes, but the effect of the family experience is smaller than the effect of genes. We're more determined with our brothers and sisters by the family that we're brought up in than we are by the genes. Do you agree? Discussion point for class. Third, a substantial portion, a big part of the variation in behavior is not accounted for by the effects of genes or families. Flip that complicated sentence over. He's saying that genes and families don't cause the varieties of behavior that we see, that it's caused by another factor. I want you to think for a moment about your brothers and sisters and your relations to them. In what ways are you similar? In what ways are you different? We look back at Turkheim. It's easy to accept laws 1 and 2 as saying that nature is more important than the environment. If the first 2 laws, if we agree with those, the nature side of the debate wins. That is, genes matter more and families, environment in matter less. However, This is really not digging deep into his point. The claim that genes are involved in all traits does not say that the environment influences it. All it says is that we can inherit traits. It doesn't say nothing else determines it. Individual genes and the environment interact, back to that term at the beginning, to influence developmental processes.